Good morning, Life Church. How are y'all doing today? Y'all are asleep, I see. How y'all doing, Life Church? I'll tell you how I'm doing. I am nervous. Just a little bit. All right. Before we get started, can we pray for just a second? Dear Heavenly Father, help. Thank you. Today we are going to get started in John 8, verses 1 through 11. I'm going to read it real quick and then we're going to dive right on in. Y'all ready? Okay. But Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives, and at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commands us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" And they were using this question as a trap, in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write in the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. And Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" Her answer was, "No one, sir." "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus said. "Now go now and leave your life of sin." All right, so maybe you can guess what I'm going to talk about this morning. And the title of this little story I wrote is called "Forget It or Faith It." And it's going along with our series this month called Faith It. And what I'm about to read to you is just kind of like a little short story I wrote based on these 11 verses. And so don't freak out, don't base your doctrine on this. This is just how I perceive this story we just read. But I'm going to get through it, and then hopefully at the end we can go through some points and leave this place a little different today. All right, here's my illustration. Jesus is sitting down by the gate, about a stone's throw away inside of the temple entrance. And even though it's only morning, there's plenty of commotion going on. Animals being led in for sacrifice, tourists and foreigners wandering around trying to find the proper gate, Levites, scribes, temple workers, all trying to be at the correct place at the correct time. And as well as the ordinary residents of Jerusalem trying to survive another day under the harsh Roman rule, trying to find and ask the Almighty for help in this cruel world they lived in. And here's Jesus without the disciples. So I'd like to think that maybe Jesus told the disciples to take the day off. But John just decided to follow him and spy on the Master and see what he was really up to. And maybe that's why you can only find this particular story in John's account of the life of Christ. So here's Jesus, taking in the morning, and I see him like this, deep in thought, with the weight of all mankind. And he just starts humming a little tune to himself. "I love these people, I love them so. I keep telling them, but soon they'll know." And he just keeps humming to himself. And then someone in the passing crowd recognizes him. "Master, is it really you?" And Jesus just smiles and continues humming, while this stranger, this man, begins to gather his family and friends to come listen to the Messiah. "I love these people, I love them so. I keep telling them, and soon they'll..." Then his song is cut short, and not by the young man and his family, but by a woman's piercing scream, followed by angry yelling and a faint thunder of a mob on the move. It began to fill everyone's ears, and the Son of God was not caught off guard or surprised. But even though he knew what was about to come next, that did not stop his heart from breaking. And soon they were at the temple gates meant to hold back armies and riots and violence. But this was welcomed in. A well-dressed mob, the finest robes belonged to Pharisees, priests, holy men. dragging a poor young lady through the streets, through the dirt, through the rocks. The light of the world knew they were coming, but still a tear rolled down his cheek and hid under his beard. He watched them come, and he finished his little tune before they were upon him. And soon they'll know. Then the leader of the righteous pack spoke. The high priest's words were elegant, sophisticated, yet saturated with a not-so-subtle sarcasm. "Master," he said, "this woman, this shameful harlot, this scourge upon our fair city, this whore, was caught in the act of an abomination, in a sin so grievous, so dirty, so terrible, so completely atrocious." Then came the word again, soaked in malice this time. "Master, this woman who does not even deserve a name was caught in the act of adultery." And the old Pharisee paused there and took in the reactions from the crowd. Gasps, scoffs. People began to look back down their noses at this young woman laying in the street, face first in the dirt. "What should we do? If you are of true Jewish descent, then you know what the law says. She is already dead. But what do you say, Messiah?" The dreaded tone returned as the high priest addressed the King of Kings. And the rest of the mob laughed under their breath, and evil grins began to appear on the faces that wore the jeweled robes of the righteous. They had come not because of the law or because of their convictions. They were there to pin this poor girl's murder on this Nazarene that challenged their order, their piety, their traditions, and most of all, he challenged their power. But there he sat, acting like he hadn't heard a word of it. Jesus had stopped hunting, but was still drawing in the dirt. I love these people. I love them so. And I keep telling them, and soon they'll know. "Master!" The silver-bearded Pharisee was now screaming at the Son of God. And in that instance, the old priest's hypocrisy was complete. And here's why. He was shouting at the creator of all existence for an answer. All the while, his mind was already made up and his ears sealed shut and not ready to receive anything that the Messiah would say next. "What should we do?" he continued. "The law of Moses says we must stone her." And this was pretty evident by the bricks in hand of every member of the mob. "But what do you say, Master?" Now let's crank it down here for a second. The tension is rising. It's getting so thick you can smell it over the bulls and the sheep being led in for sacrifice. Every member of this Christian gang's ears are burning. They're on fire, waiting for the reply that was to come. Yes, give her what she deserves, death, stone her. Then they would appeal to the Romans, to Pilate, that this Jesus advocates murder. Or option 2, the great Redeemer would say, "No, leave her alone, she has not sinned." Then they would run to Herod, the real king of the Jews, and to the Sanhedrin, to the elders of the law, to claim blasphemy and high treason against the law of Moses and Jehovah God himself. This entire thing was a setup. It was a lose-lose for the hope of the world. He was trapped with no way out, or so the Pharisees had hoped. "Master," the lawful hypocrite's voice began to unravel and show his impatience. "What do you say?" And I think Jesus just kept looking at the ground for another moment. Not because he was trying to ignore the high priest, this wise studier of the laws for countless years. Jesus wasn't trying to brush them off, the very people that should have been the first to recognize what the Savior looked like. The peace on earth, the great Redeemer, God's only Son. Jesus was simply shedding his last tear in silence for these confused religious men, because he knew they weren't even going to understand what was about to happen. And we're going to come back here in just a second, but now I want to look at this story through a couple different sets of eyes. So let's jump to our second piece of the story. The disciple John didn't know her name, so in the scripture she remains nameless, ageless, and raceless. But the whole point of this little story is to make it personal, to add in some details, make a little connection. So her name's Lydia, and she's 19 years old, a little Jewish girl. So one morning, Lydia wakes up, rubs her eyes. She gets up out of bed. She looks around the tiny house. that she inherited after her late mother passed. The previous year, Lydia's mother had died in a riot against the Roman occupation. As it moved through their street and swept through, the unfortunate woman was caught up in the collateral damage. And her father had left the family years before to join the Sicarii, the Zealots, after a terrible event happened in their home that involved a drunk, lustful Roman guard and a young, innocent Lydia. The young girl was now unclean. The mother was heartbroken. The father was enraged, and her brother was lost in disbelief. The family was devastated. Soon after, her brother and her father vowed vengeance and left to join the righteous rebel murderers in the hills. But she had not heard from them in years already. Surely they had been captured or executed, or worse. The Romans didn't take kindly to insurrectionists, rebels, or revolutionaries. They were all gone for good, and that was as much of the truth as she wished to remember. But this morning, Lydia was looking for a boyfriend, Daniel. Then she figured he'd probably already left in the early morning. Because you see, the relationship was not necessarily be blessed by their neighbors, family, or friends. Not in this culture, not in this day and age. But society didn't know about the love they had, she said to herself. And after daydreaming for a moment in the main room, she went to make the bed and found a coin pouch next to it. She was overjoyed. You see, when Lydia's mother had died, she inherited the small house with a huge debt to the tax collectors. And before she was alone, Lydia and her mother would go gleaning in the fields to help make ends meet. And they sold most of the remaining possessions in the house before she had passed. But now there was nothing left for the tax collectors to take. Even if she had had money to pay the matchmakers to help her find a husband, no man would take her, a defiled woman, as a wife. She had nothing. She was young and scared, and she was making it doing the only thing she could. She began to sell her body. She had to roam the streets at night, and it was dirty. It was scary. It was wretched. And she knew it. She felt it. She hated it. But that was ages ago, it felt like. That was before Daniel came into her life. Daniel had saved her. He helped her with the taxes. He took care of her. He said he loved her. He said he was even going to leave his wife for her. And he talked of running away with her to Crete and change their names and live like royalty and have so many kids and be happy forever. And this was her dream. And it felt wrong, but she didn't care. All she wanted was to be free from this debt, free from this life of shame and hardship, free from this nightmare, free from a past that kept haunting her. Daniel was a godsend. He could save her. So Lydia made the bed and took a large urn to go fetch some water for some flowers Daniel had brought her last night. She wrapped her face, stepped into the street, and made her way to the well. And as Lydia rounded the corner alleyway to the street where the well sat in the middle of the square, she waited in the alley until the older women were done, filling their own pots. She couldn't stand the way they looked at her over their own ugly noses. And while she waited, Daniel rushed throughout the square. He was frantic. He was searching for his young lover. "Daniel," she cried, muffled through her veil. He immediately found her deep green eyes and ran to her. In a panic, he grabbed her arm and took her further into the shadows of the alley. "Lydia, you must leave Jerusalem," Daniel told her in a hush. "Forget your things and leave now." Her hands stiffened. The water pot fell and crashed. Lydia's eyes widened and began to fill with tears. "You're not coming with me?" And the tears were now getting bigger in her soft eyes. "That's not the issue," his eyes darting around the street, paranoid, frantic. "You must leave town and you must leave now." "I won't," she replied, "not without you." "It cannot happen, Lydia. You must go, and you must go now." She wanted to weep, but she composed herself. "I understand, Daniel. Go back to your wife. Go back to your life. I understand what has happened." And she leaned into the shadows and kissed him one last time. "I will miss you, but I cannot leave this place without you. It's all I know. Goodbye, Daniel." And he stood motionless in the alleyway. Lydia left him there, and she sobbed all the way home. His wife surely must have found out, she thought. Her dreams were crushed. Her godsend was no more. Daniel had frozen after the kiss, still standing in the alley. He could barely breathe. His nightmare was coming true. Now, I have one more piece to this puzzle, and then we'll get to the good stuff. All right. There was a good man in Jerusalem, born to Nathanael and Martha, that belonged to the house or tribe of Reuben. And he had been to synagogue every Sabbath his whole life. He had learned to be a generous giver. He loved Jehovah. He was a blessed man. He even committed his life to studying the Torah and teaching the Holy Scriptures and encouraging his fellow Jews to turn from evil and look to the Almighty God for answers. And he was growing. He was becoming an excellent young Pharisee. Yes, Daniel was a good man. His wife would add to this, of course. She would say he worked too much. He didn't make enough money. He didn't spend enough time at home with her. Perhaps Daniel was overzealous. Perhaps he was angry with her. She didn't know. They'd been married for 5 years already, but for half of those years it felt like they hadn't had a real conversation. She felt like she lost him already. She couldn't give him a child, and it seemed like his goodness and his love could not overlook that painful fact. So without a hope for a family, Daniel poured all of his life into his study, into his writing, into his reading, into his work. And work was good. He was no longer a simple scribe. He was now regularly asked to read from the Holy Word in the synagogue. He was even granted the right to help the priest with the Feast of First Fruits the year before. He was impressing Pharisees and Sadducees alike. His zeal was growing, and it was very evident in his service and his study. Then one day, Father Caiaphas sent for him, and Daniel had never met the high priest before, and he could not think of why he wished to see him, but he was excited all the same. Perhaps this was his chance to serve on the Temple Mount. Perhaps he would be sent out to serve in the other synagogues across Judea. He didn't know. He was just excited. Finally, God was going to use him. Finally, he was going to be taken to the next level of his walk. Finally, he was there. And Daniel took a deep breath and crossed the threshold. "Master, you wish to speak with me?" "Ah, yes, I am pleased by your focus and great service, my son. And I have come upon a very special task for you. Now it has come to my attention that a harlot dares to bring her wickedness to the heart of our fair city. And in the decades before, we have pushed them out and made them flee to the outer gates and to Samaria itself, where we cannot find them. By law, she is to be stoned. Will you find her and let us purify the city once again? Will you do it?" Daniel thought for a moment and answered, "God's law is my only law, Master," he replied. "I will return only when I have found her out." Caiaphas was pleased, and the high priest said, "Excellent. Go with God, my son." And after that meeting, Daniel was excused from his usual duties. He put on normal robes and began to comb the streets and alleys for any rumors of this new seductress. Until one night he was standing outside a tavern by the window. He had made no progress for 2 weeks, not even a hint of a clue. And he could hear the usual ruckus coming from inside the speakeasy. And it was mostly Roman soldiers off duty sharing a round, a couple tax collectors celebrating the day's extra income, some shepherds in town singing songs louder than they did on the hillside, it seemed. But then, through all the drunken Latin and Hebrew mumbling and laughter and the noise, he heard a voice separate from the rest. The voice began to talk about God and his kingdom. And he was comparing it to mustard. How dare he, Daniel thought. This is surely to be some drunken blasphemy. So he turned and looked into the window of the inn and saw the man drawing the attention of most of the patrons inside. The man that was now standing, not as some poor fool filled with too much wine, but this man stood tall, calm, confident, and spoke with a gentle fervor. "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. In the beginning, when it is first sown, it is the smallest of all seeds. But when it finds soil and takes root, then it grows, and it can grow greater than all the other herbs and grow large branches that even the birds can rest in its shade." And many in the inn began to ask the speaker what this meant, and Daniel too began to ponder the words he had just heard. Strange, he thought. It might make a little sense, but it's mustard. And as he started to dissect what the strange man was talking about, something caught his eye in the alley not far from the tavern. A man leaned into the shadows, and Daniel could see his mouth move. A whisper, perhaps. Then a slim, dark-robed figure appeared from the shadows, took the man's hand, and disappeared into the alleyway. Daniel had questions for this scribe, or whoever he was talking out of place inside the tavern, but that would have to wait. Something was afoot across the street in the shade, and it required his immediate attention. And he made it quickly to the alleyway and all the way down to the next corner. Daniel peeked around and caught a glimpse of the pair darting across the next square, out of the moonlight and into more shadows. He threw his hood over his head and followed quickly, trying to remain out of sight. He tailed the couple throughout the maze, his heart racing the whole time as they all dashed behind the backhand of Jerusalem, weaving, sneaking, peeking, barely even letting one of his feet touch the main roads, always under the veil of darkness. Then they stopped. The couple entered through a back entrance into a smaller home, closer to the center of the city, and he slowly crept to a window to investigate further. The wooden coverings on the side window were open, only a crack, but it was plenty for Daniel to see more than enough of what was taking place inside. He knew this was the place. He knew this was the adulteress. But then she turned, and he saw her face and was shocked. This couldn't be. This is no seductress, he thought. This was no cat house, no madam of the night. This was not what he imagined at all. This was just a girl with a young face and beautiful eyes, full of some kind of broken innocence. He turned and leaned against the wall, and it felt like his chest was filling with sand. It was so heavy, so sad for this poor female and the situation she was in, but even more so, the imminent fate that was to come. Daniel had witnessed a stoning before, and at the thought his stomach turned, and he rushed back into the night away from the simple shamble of a house. He ran for hours, but he didn't run home. He didn't run to Caiaphas. He just ran to the temple. He sat down by the gates of the outer courts and just wept. I can't do it, he cried. I can't. And then he just kept talking to himself. He's like, but if I must, I must. So he followed her. He followed her every night after that. And the next couple of days turned into weeks. He had already had enough evidence to prove adultery, yet he decided he needed more and took it a step further. He waited by the tavern long after the hot sun had set. He waited by the shadows where he knew she would be. Then he could see a shifting in the dark, and there she was, and he was going to catch her in the act, firsthand. He leaned into the shade and whispered to her. She took his hands, and at that moment, his plan to march her down to Master Caiaphas immediately melted away. As he looked into her deep green eyes, she whisked him throughout the alleyways, through the maze he had already memorized every part. He knew it was wrong, but it felt okay. This was where he wanted to be every other time he had followed her. Now he was here, at her door, his other life meaningless, his mission forgotten. Daniel was undone. Now, Daniel's life had already changed, but now he felt completely upside down, and the next months were lived in a different light. To his wife, he was just too busy with work, never home. To his new lover, he was Daniel the wineskin maker. And to his leader and high priest, he was on the trail, but he hadn't found anything good yet. This holy man was now drowning in lies, only kept afloat, only by the love he was never meant to have. But good Daniel put these things out of his mind. Then as he made his way up to the market in the early morning, he came upon some of his fellow priests. And just as a greeting was about to leave his lips, he overheard their conversation. You mean the adulteress the high priest has been seeking? The older of the priests asked. Yes, Brother Bartholomew says he has spotted her in the center squares many times, and now Master Caiaphas has a plan to move, said the other. But what will he do without an exact location? I do not know. I just know that the Nazarene is in town again and has caused the high priest to become restless. I also know we are about to be late to this special meeting at the synagogue, so let us hurry, brother. Daniel froze, dead in his tracks. Immediately, all he could see were stones flying, falling, crashing and crushing, destroying and burying his fair Lydia. He could still save her, he thought. He flew down to the street, dashing throughout the shortcuts between alleys and small city squares, till he came to the square that her front door faced. He darted around the back streets till he came to the window and jumped in. He began to shout, Lydia, Lydia, answer me. Where are you? Had they reached her already? How could they have found her? They were so careful. No, he thought, she can't be far. He ran to the marketplace, to the baker. Then finally he reached the well. And he caught her in the shade of the corridor. He took her away from the watchful eyes that no one else could see. He told her she must flee. He tried to tell her she was in danger, but she would not hear it. She simply left with no promise of fleeing the city. She was doomed. But if she saw him again, if she knew of his true life, he would be joining her under that pile of bricks. His mind began to snap under the weight of fear and paranoia that swept through his imagination. His father, his mother, would be overcome with dishonor. His wife would fall to the poverty that came to every widow, and accompanied by a new shame that only he was at fault for. His life unraveled before his eyes. "No," he cried, "I can still fix this." And with that, he began to weep as he leaned on the alley walls. He could see it all happening in his mind. It's all tragic, terrifying. "I'm sorry, but it's the only way," he said to himself. Then he was off. He ran faster than before, straight to the synagogue. He was still dressed in rags, but he did not care or have time for the formalities of ceremonial dress, often required to meet with the elders. He burst into the main hall, and they were in the middle of great debate, as per usual. But his unannounced entrance brought a pause. They looked upon him with a scorn, and they demanded a reason for this rude interruption. "Master Caiaphas," he yelled, trying to overcome his own fear of the powerful men in the room. "It's me, it's Daniel, and I bring you good news." They began to talk amongst themselves for a moment, until Caiaphas stood and said, "Well, good, brother," the high priest said. "Tell us this news." "I have found the harlot. I know where we can find the adulteress you seek," Daniel said, as his back buckled beneath his dirty robes. The other Pharisees and priests immediately gave him all their attention. This was the final piece to their plan. They were ready to move on a new threat to the Jewish nation, and surely this Daniel was a godsend. They quickly congratulated and honored him, and gave him new purple robes to replace the wretched rags that clung to his shoulders. He told them the street. He told them the square. He told them the house. He told them everything they needed to know. The other priests told Daniel to make haste, to change his robes, and to meet him at the temple. "You are the prime witness, brother," they said, "and according to Deuteronomy, thine hand shall be the first." And Daniel could feel his soul shatter, but he hid it all behind a comfortable new scowl and a grimace. And he said, "Let us do what must be done, brothers." So they hurried down the streets to the temple. The city seemed so strange from this view. He had spent the last year remaining anonymous in the shadows, but now he walked in the middle of the pristine, wide road. And as his mind wandered to and through every alley that he knew, wrapped circles around this main road, he could remember all the terrible things he had seen in the shadows, things that these men of the cloth that accompanied him now would never know, realities they would never understand, these thoughts that used to consume him and move him to passionate tears. He now tucked them behind his new purple robes. And Daniel reached the temple before the rest of the mob. He looked around for this traitor that they were trying to capture in this plan. He looked around and saw no danger. He thought that maybe the informant made an error. But then he heard the voice again, the one he had heard half a year ago. And just then Daniel recognized the voice's face. He could hear the murderous mob of Pharisees approaching. The Nazarene, they called him, now looked straight into Daniel's brown eyes. Every guilty instance from the young Pharisee's life flashed before his eyes, and he felt as if the strange man accused of treachery could see every one of them too. They locked eyes for only a second, but to Daniel it felt like lifetimes. "Master!" a cry came that snapped Daniel back into reality. And there they stood, the mob, the high priest. And then Lydia was thrown from the rowdy crowd into the dirt in front of this man. The man with eyes that pierced through the physical world itself, it seemed. Daniel took a step back, but his brothers found him and handed him a heavy round rock. And they said to Daniel, "The time has come. Let God's will be done." So here we are. We've come full circle. And I hope you can see it all in your mind now. A couple people's little backstory. The high priest laying a trap for the Savior of the world. The poor, broken adulteress crying in the filth of the courtyard. The pious young Pharisee screaming on the inside, hiding behind this thin, shallow crust of an exterior. And Jesus, still over here, sitting on a rock, with his hands in the dirt. And I use this phrase because it's true even to this day, like even today. It's exactly where he'll be. And you might be curious and ask, like, why on earth is Jesus messing in the dirt when all this important stuff is going on around him? And that's a good question. Why is he even bothering with your dirty mess today? But he is, because he loves you. But let's get back to the story. Master, what do you say? The high priest said, echoed by the crowd's questions to each other. What will he say? What will he say? Then Jesus looked up from the dirt and slowly stood straight up, commanding the attention of everyone in the courtyard, but only looking at the high priest dead in the eyes. And the Son of God spoke in a calm, strong voice that overcame the crowds in the courtyard. If any of you is without sin, then the Messiah's eyes left the high priest and found Daniel's in the back, trying to escape, terrified of the truth that stared him down. If any of you are without sin, you may cast the first stone. The rock in Daniel's hand suddenly quadrupled in weight. He let it drop to the ground and sank back into a shadowy corridor in the temple. The rest of the members of the mob were almost equally convicted and confused. Every word escaped the high priest, and he could say nothing. He only huffed and puffed. Then he turned and left. He left the poor girl at the feet of Jesus. And there is Lydia on the ground, drowning in her own tears. She hasn't heard a word of what has happened because of the sound of her own sobs. Earlier, she had left the well heartbroken, only moments later to be arrested and sentenced to death, then dragged to the streets to the feet of this ordinary-looking man for final judgment. And she knew the answer already. She knew what she deserved. And as soon as they had taken her, she knew why. She had called out through the sobs for redemption, something she knew she would never know. But now her eyes red, tired, barely able to see through the pain of past mistakes. And she could recount every one, every sin. And they greatly outnumbered the rocks, not only in the hands of the angry mob, but even in the cobblestone street itself. And then she wiped her eyes. And she looks up, and she finds this man looking at her. But not like other men had ever looked at her. Every other man's eyes stopped at her body, at her appearance, at her beauty. But this man's eyes saw straight into her heart. And this man felt all of that pain from the past, all the way back to the worst day of her life. Time seemed to stop. She was reliving that nightmare, but not in fear or tragedy or guilt, like all the times before, where she would wake up in the middle of the night. Because this time he was there. The strange man with a voice like no other man. And all he was saying was, look to me. In the middle of her nightmare, he called to her, look to me. And she stopped watching the replay of the tragic memory and looked at him. Then it melted away all the nightmares, all the pain, all the shame. And then they were back in real life, in the dirt, in the courtyard. She was still looking into the Savior's eyes, and he looked up for a moment at Daniel across the courtyard and then back down and asked, who is left? Where are your accusers? Who here condemns you? The eternal judge over all creation asked her. And here's the point I want to make today. Who was left? Who was in the courtyard that could condemn her? Because her response means the world here. It changes everything about how she was living. Because there was one person there that could have ruined the entire thing. Who here condemns you? And I'm talking about physical people. Because we all understand that the enemy is always there to condemn you. But who is left that will judge you? That would judge this girl the harshest? Who's going to try and reach back into her history and bring all that ugliness to light? Have you guessed yet? Because it's not the high priest. He's already gone. He's already tried to sling mud and shame all over this lady to the point of violent crowd justice. But it didn't stick. He's failed. And it's not the mob either, because they too have realized that their hidden agenda is not so hidden in the presence of the light of the world. They have given up as well. So who's left? Is it Daniel, her partner in crime, the liar, the two-faced priest, the unfaithful husband? Of course not, because Daniel's in the exact same boat. So where are the accusers? Because for Daniel there is one, and for Lydia there is one too. So who is it? Is it Jesus, the King of Kings, the Alpha, the Omega, the healer, the ruler of all things we will ever know? The only being that has ever walked the earth that actually had the power, that actually had the right, and that actually had the ability to judge. Nope, it wasn't even Jesus. Who here condemns you? He asked her. And her answer is so important, it's so mind-blowing, because the answer to the question before, who could ruin this moment, who could accuse, the answer is Lydia. Who had the power to wreck Lydia's life with judgment in this moment? It was her. It wasn't even the very people that had the power to destroy her physical body. It was only herself. And the same for Daniel. But he was too busy being afraid that everyone would find out what he already knew and stayed in the shadows. That is why the answer, she says, is perfect. Who here is accusing you? Who here is saying you're nothing? Who here is telling you that you don't deserve to live? Is there anyone left here to accuse you? And her answer is amazing. Despite all that history, all that guilt, all that shame, all the whispers in her ears, she still said, "No one, sir." Now, all of the story is just to set the stage for this moment right here. The most important point in Lydia's life, and it's the same for us. Maybe you woke up this morning with a history so terrible you can't even bear the thought of remembering it. A shame so heavy it feels like it's crushing the life out of you every day. But it's there. It's still there, even after you cried all night. It's still there after the drugs are gone and the high wears off. It's still there after you drank through a bottle of liquor just because you can't stand the memory. Why? Who? For me, it's me. For you, it's you. And I'm not telling you this so that you feel guilty or sorry for yourself. No. It's exactly the opposite. Because God has an amazing future for you, and He wants you to reach out and take it and live it. But you are never going to have room for it if you keep dragging the past into every new day. You have to let it go. The root of the problem is one thing, and it's deep down inside. If you're an emotional person, it's wrapped up in your heart. If you're an intellectual person, it's buried in your brain. But no matter where it's hiding, it's called the same thing. Unforgiveness. And it's all over this story I just told you. And maybe you've tried everything you can do to fix it. Even has gone as far as getting rid of it. And you avoid certain places because it reminds you of it. You're careful. You've done all a person can physically do to be free of a memory. You've tried to forget it. But for some reason you can't. As many times as you've tried, as much energy as you've put into it, all the blood, sweat, and tears you've used up trying to bury it. And it keeps crawling out of the ground like a smelly, nasty, rotten zombie of a nightmare that won't let you leave it. It won't let it die. It won't let you rest. It won't let you move on. It won't let you live. It won't let you forget about it. And there are so many different versions and forms, ranging from personal, hidden self-loathing all the way to public, humiliating judgment. And it's all rooted in one thing: unforgiveness. So if you remember anything I have to say, remember this. You have to forgive. And you have to start with yourself. And before we close, I would like to admit something to you real quick. Unforgiveness is not a real word. I don't know where I get that from. But you know what I'm talking about. You get it. It's the opposite of forgiveness. But while I was trying to find unforgiveness in the dictionary, I did actually look up the definition for forgiveness in the real antonym. Forgive means to stop blame and grant pardon. Sounds good. And a couple of my favorite synonyms are absolve, condone, to excuse, acquit, to give amnesty, to clear, to efface, to exculpate, to exempt, to exonerate, to overlook, to release, to relent, to remit, to let go, to accept apology, to dismiss from the mind. And this is my favorite, to think no more of. So what is unforgiveness really? What is the real word for it? What is the opposite of all these words that explain what we need to do to ourselves and everyone every day? The antonym for forgive is condemn, accuse, blame. Now let's get back to John 8:10. Then Jesus asked her, "Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Is there anyone left to condemn you?" What's your answer today? Who's left to condemn you? Because while other people can judge us all they want, it really has no effect on us. No real effect. But it's if you can let go. Because you're the only one that knows the worst things in your life. Nobody else is going to know the things you struggle with the most unless you tell them. "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you. Go, leave your life of sin." And what Jesus is saying here is not, okay, I don't condemn you. Don't sin ever again. Because that's impossible. We're humans and we're going to mess it up. And as much as God will forgive you, it doesn't mean anything if you can't forgive yourself. Because that's where it starts. Forgive yourself. And then like Pastor Melvin preached a couple months ago, you have to forgive others. And then God forgives you. And it comes full circle. It is complete. You have mastered forgiveness. And you just have to keep the cycle going. And what he is saying here is, go, live your life. You don't have to go do those things you did. You don't have to be who you were. Go, leave your old life. Go, let it all go. Forgive and have faith to go be different. When we live in this kind of forgiveness, we are free. And we are free enough to leave the old life behind. And you probably won't be able to completely forget it. But no matter what it is, as long as you remember to look to Jesus and remember that you are forgiven. Thank you guys so much.
Let's all stand. I was hoping he would finish that so I wouldn't have to follow it. Can you just bow your heads with me, please? Surely I've never heard a more vivid picture of John chapter 8. We all had an opportunity to go back to that square. We had an opportunity to be transported back and to be part of the story. Every story in the Bible is not meant for information alone. It's not meant just to provide us good reading or great inspirational thoughts and things to tweet. The story of the Bible, every single word from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation are recorded for you and I so that we would embrace it and that we would be changed. That we could hear that song that Josh referred to. Zephaniah says that he sings over us. Oh, how I love you. The story that God so longs for us to live will never, ever be realized in our lives if we do not grab hold of this element of forgiveness. Who condemns you? Who is it that will condemn you? And this morning, each one of us in our own perspective or in our own respective lives, we have the ability to derail what God so longs to do in our life. We possess the power and the ability to prevent God from just doing so much in our lives by continuing to embrace the guilt, the shame, by continuing to walk in the unforgiveness and the accusations. Every one of us in this place, we've all messed up. The Bible says all have sinned. All have fallen short of the glory of God. Every one of us. Freedom from sin starts with forgiveness. Forgive others, sure, we've heard so many messages about that. Forgiveness of ourselves. How many in this place, with every head bowed, every eye closed, this is a very, very, very special and private moment between you and the Lord. It becomes public. It becomes public after God begins to do something in our life. But right now, this is not a public moment, even though you're standing in the midst of a crowd. It's a private moment between you and the Lord. And how many of you in this place would say, Scott, that message is for me? I can hear the Lord asking me, who's left to condemn you? And I want to be able to answer just like this nameless woman of John 8 that Josh has given her a name in the story for us today. How many of you want to answer this morning like she answered Christ? Raising her head from the dirt. No one. No one. Today I'm stopping. Today the guilt, the condemnation gets washed away by true forgiveness. Anybody in this house this morning would say, Scott, that's what I want my answer to be today. I need forgiveness. I find myself at the feet of Jesus today. And I need His help even to forgive myself. Come on, church. Anybody here? Anybody here? Maybe it's just your first time this morning, but you just know God's in this message for you today, and it's all for you. You can just lift your hands up quietly there. Again, it's not for anyone else, just for you and the Lord. There's hands all over this place. Thank you.